So in this seventh sabbatical reading and feeding, Wetito, or Wayyetse, or Wayyetse, the coming out that begins from Genesis 28 and 10, and it's to Genesis 32 and 3. We're now covering the overview for chapter 29, where it discusses and gives us the mythos and the story, the parable of Yaakob's years at Haran. We learn that Yaakub at Haran, he becomes a striking illustration, if not a type of the nation descended from him in its present long dispersion. Or we can say it's a type of us as a nation descended from our ancestor Yaakub in our present long dispersion. And we're speaking more than even the 400 years and more than just the West African experience of us as Beta Israel, and more than just even our trans-African experience. You understand? This is going way back. But like Israel, Yaakub was one out of the place of the barakat, according to Genesis 26 and 3. He was out of that place of blessing. Like we are out of the place. There is a place of blessing even for us as the once lost but now found. Beta Israel, the Falashes of the West. Even as elect Ras Tafari, we are not in the place. If we're in the West, if we're in Babylon, we're not in the place of blessing. So we are like our father ancestor Yaakov. Secondly, we are without a Messiah, without an altar, according to Hosea chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. And each of these quotes are references for the more diligent students to really study these verses and links so one can get the full picture. Thirdly, we have gained an evil name, as Yaakov also had gained an evil name. Genesis 31 and 1, Romans chapter 2, verses 17 to 24 also gives us more illumination on that point. Fourthly, it says, but was under the covenant Kir. We're under the Al-Kidan in Kibkabe, or the Kir of the covenant concerning Yahweh, concerning Jah, concerning Yah. Genesis 28, verses 13 and 14, Romans 11, verse 1, and verse 25 to 30. So we are still under the Al-Kidan Kir of Yah. We as once lost but now found Beta Israel. In fact, our whole experience as so-called black folks, Negroes, you understand, shows that we are under care of the Almighty. That if it wasn't for the Almighty, we would be as Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, fifthly, he was ultimately brought back. He was ultimately restored, as we also will ultimately be restored. And this is what makes this time so very important with 2012 and everything. This is what makes this particular prophetic time that we're living in. Now, Genesis 31 and 3, as well as Genesis 35, 1 to 4, Ezekiel 37, verses 21 to 23 also gives us more insight into that restoration, that return, that aliyah, that memeles, that return. You understand? Ka Babylon memeles sachin karb betam karno is very near our coming out. You understand? Now, there's personal lesson here. There's a personal lesson in this chapter, chapter 29. Of Genesis concerning this seventh sabbatical reading, Wetito Wayyetse, or the coming out, where it states that, and Yaakov went out from Beersheba. Even Beersheba, very important teaching on these names. We don't have the opportunity to go into all the detail right here, but we advise the diligent student, Yobsen, to do so. And he went toward Haran. What does Yaakov's name mean? What does Beersheba mean? What is the significance of that, going back to the root of the initiation and the wisdom of Muse? This is why Gerald Macy's works come in very handy here, Yovasan, as we compare it, use the comparative method with the Metzaf Kedus, the Ethiopic Genesis, and the authorized Amharic Bible of Kedamawi Haile Selassie here. Kedu Sabatachin Malet. Now the personal lesson is obvious. While Yaiqob, Jacob, is not forsaken, he is permitted to reap the shame and sorrow of his self-chosen way. And this is an example for us in this very day and time. This is not excusing what Jacob did, because Jacob is a very, very interesting type. This is why in the Toledot, you understand, we had so many parts to that series, and even then we were just giving an overview. I mean, that's almost like a whole semester study if you really would understand what does the whole twins, the twinning mean, and Yaakov and Esau. You understand? It's not as superficial as counterfeit Christianity may have taught you, or so-called historic and Gentile Christianity, Gentile, white, Western misinterpretations have taught you, because not coming from the true kamite mythos or the wisdom school of the Kupt of ancient Egypt, where Moses was learned in all that wisdom. He's the author of this book. So if we would understand the Genesis in its proper aspect, we have to understand it from the kamite mythos and have to have an insight into what Moses was learned and what was he familiar with. So when we read these things, we can see it in its proper context according to the original author of the work, so we do not be like the counterfeits do, and get caught up and confused on mistranslation, you understand, and misinterpretation. So this chapter is very, very important for us, because we learn that Yaakov, although he is permitted to reap the shame and the sorrow and gain an evil name, but he was not forsaken. He was not forsaken. So that's chapter 29 right there. That's an overview of it, but there's so much more details as we get into the more detailed studies of this. But this is a basic foundation, hopefully to encourage the brothers and sisters to study the Sabbath, the Sabbatical, remember the Sabbath, and study the Sabbatical readings and teachings on their own and in their family and in their respective communities. Now, chapter 30, you understand, continues on, and this now shows the interesting relationship between Yaakov, between Laban, his father-in-law, between Leah, you understand, his first wife, and Rahel, his second wife, even though Rahel was to be his first wife. But similar to what happened with his birthright, we see something interesting going on with Laban's two daughters, the elder who was Leah and the younger who was Rahel. So a very interesting story on Yaakov and his two wives, and the whole experience and the birthing out now of the 12 sons and the one daughter, Dinah, is very, very interesting. This is what's discussed in more of the chapter 29 as we go into chapter 30 and we get into chapter 31, and we can go through each of the individual sons, you understand, and put the 12, this number, into its proper mythical context. You understand? Because this is where the meanings, the original meanings, derive from there. Now, at the 31st chapter, there's a parenthesis, which is now the call back. There's a call back now to BETH-EL. There's an angelic call. An angel of Elohim spoke to Yaakov in a dream, now calling him back to the BETH-EL and the particular pillar, or the howlet, or the obelisk, or the stela, which he raised and which was raised there. And this is the whole teaching as well on the Met'abah and the Met'abat as well. What does that mean, this pillar, this obelisk? And we have a lot of symbology of this, both the circumcised one of Ethiopia and then the uncircumcised stelas and obelisks of Egypt and other places is a very key thing, that all howlet and obelisk are not the same. But now there's the flight of Yaakov which this chapter continues. Chapter 31, it discusses the flight of Yaiqob concerning the Laban, his father-in-law situation. And then when we get to chapter 32, because this continues the seventh sabbatical reading to Genesis 32 and 3, we have these verses right here where it concerns Yaiqob, the supplanter. He now becomes Israel. He becomes Israel, a prince with God, or according to that cartouche from ancient Egypt, he actually becomes Ya'qob, the Ya'qob, as Exaviher, Re'issa, he becomes a Ya'qob, or the Jacob Horus, Israel, a prince with the Elohim, the Net Eru.